Thank you. All right. I'm a professor of the history of American art, and I am especially interested in researching how people who often haven't been trained in traditional fine art forms have nevertheless found really interesting ways to use visual media like photography to visualize themselves and their worlds, empowering themselves in the process. I find family photographs especially interesting. We all are very familiar with family photographs, probably have more of them than we can even organize. But in terms of our broader cultural and national histories, these objects are often overlooked. Partly that's due to their association with women, the domestic, and craft. But these objects tell really important histories too, and not just histories of our families, but those family histories actually have a lot to say about our broader cultural and national histories. So my research into 19th century African American women's family photo albums is a great example of how family photographs are important and how they can resist stereotypes circulating in the broader visual culture, which makes them useful for telling more truthful stories where people are controlling their own representations. Taking and keeping family photos, both in our own homes, but also importantly in public institutions and archives, is a vital way for communities to exert control over their representation. So I'm going to talk today about two 19th century African American women's photograph albums. One of the women is Ellen Craft, who you're seeing on the left. You might be familiar with her. She's well known in African American history for being a woman who famously escaped enslavement with her husband, William, from Georgia all the way up to Philadelphia. So covering a vast quantity of land and also doing it as a pair, which was quite an extraordinary feat. And she made her album in the 1860s. You're seeing it just below her photograph, which was the first decade that photo albums existed. Photography had been invented in 1839, but until the 1860s, photographs were usually one-of-a-kind objects where the image that was taken in the camera was a direct positive, so there was no negative. It was just that one image. So you might have 1 to 5 photos in your home, but until a new type of photograph was invented in the 1850s that had a negative and could be reproduced over and over again very cheaply, people didn't start to amass lots of photographs. But once that new type of photograph, which was French, and it's called a carte de visite, like a visiting card, once that was invented, then all of a sudden people start to need books to organize their photographs because you can get, 20 copies of a photograph cheaply and give it to all your friends and families. So her photograph album is a great example of like the earliest kind of photographs albums. And then Arabella Chapman on the right here, she was one generation younger than Ellen Craft. Not famous at her time, still notable. She was born free in New Jersey, and she became the first woman of color to graduate from Albany, New York's public high school. She was making her album in the 1870s and 1880s, and still using the kind of photographs that Kraft would have been keeping in her album, these carte de visites. And in many ways, even though the albums are separated by a couple decades, they look pretty similar in terms of the styles of the album themselves and the styles of the photographs on the inside. The first photo albums were modeled after what had been the most important book in many American homes up to this point, which was the family Bible. They have a thick embossed cover, gilded page edges. Sometimes they have little clasps to hold them, like you can see in these two photographs. But the family photo album quickly becomes just as important as the family Bible in many homes as a record keeper of your ancestry, both in written form. Family photo albums would often have a page at the beginning for you to record the names and birth dates and death dates of family members, but then also in visual form, where you now actually have images of all these family members to keep for posterity. All right, so both of these albums were made by these women and then kept by women members of the family to whom the albums passed. And then eventually both of them end up in public archives. So public archives then take on the task of preserving these albums, which is why I'm able to talk about them today with you all. Ellen Craft's album is in the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture in Charleston, South Carolina, where I'm located. That's how I came across this album. And then Arabella Chapman's albums are in the University of Michigan's William L. Clements Library, and they've actually fully digitized them. The Craft album is digitized now too, but I was able to find Chapman's album just online because it was digitized and there was a fair amount written about it and accessible. So I'm going to talk to you today about these two albums and argue that these women used photography to construct affirmative images of themselves, their families, and their communities during periods of widespread dehumanizing imagery of African Americans in the popular national media. What I'm also going to share with you is something that I was a surprise while doing this research, that these two women who were a generation apart, one living in Charleston after the Civil War. She had to escape to London, Ellen Craft, during the Civil War, or after 1850, but then came back to the United States. One, Arabella Chapman, living in Albany, New York. They actually are distantly related, cousins by marriage, and that is visible in their albums, but otherwise has kind of been forgotten in family history. So the albums actually preserve that kind of unexpected connection. All right. So in discussions in photo history, there's a lot of really interesting research about how famous formerly enslaved individuals used photography to construct public images of themselves that counteracted stereotypes. So you're seeing images here of Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, who both were formerly enslaved, escaped enslavement, and then used photography very savvily to present images of themselves that worked against pro-slavery arguments about the inferiority of African Americans. Frederick Douglass was the most photographed 19th century American, edging out Lincoln, and sat for photos wherever he went, and used that as to counteract so many stereotypes. Right? These images, these sitters present themselves as noble, intelligent, dignified, fully human. And they also chose photography to do that, right? There's a truth value in photography. The light rays bounce off the person and get recorded in the image. So unlike a painting or a drawing, you can claim that these images are really showing you the truth. And so the choice of using photography was intentional, right? That this is the truth, right? Ignore those racist caricatures, minstrelsy images, things like that. Like the camera's going to show you the truth. And so both of them were making very public images with photography to counteract stereotypes. Now, photography had been used by enslavers too. Photography is invented in 1839, so there's this, short-ish period, up to the Civil War, where both abolitionists and enslavers are using photography to try to visualize truthful images about enslavement. There are not lots of photographs of the enslaved that exist, but ones that do, that were taken forcibly by the hands of enslavers, are showing the enslaved in terms of the labor value that they are providing for enslavers, right? So on the left here, we have this example of Hector, whose name is recorded by the enslaver in a photograph. And he's being shown for his value because he was a highly valued laborer who oared every day into the city of Charleston to gather the mail and social correspondence, and return back out to the plantations for the enslaver with that valuable information. So he's shown with his oar, he's shown with his satchel that would carry the mail and correspondence, and that is his value in the photograph, right? The labor, not, he's not shown with his family. He is shown for the value that he provides for his enslaver. There are many, many images of enslaved nurses with the enslaver's children. These women who were most likely mothers are not shown with their own children, right? There aren't records of them with their children. They're shown for the labor that they're providing that is of value to the enslaver caring for the enslavers' children, right? So Douglas and Truth are making very public images where they are not laboring, or if anything, Truth is doing domestic crafts for herself, right, in her own home. And they're presenting themselves as intelligent, capable, noble, dignified, for fully human reasons beyond just the value of a particular form of labor, right? So we have these very public images. Um, but what about private images, right? That formerly enslaved and free African American women make? Like what kinds of stories are being told when people are using photography not on a national stage, but for themselves, within their families, or for their more local communities? Now, let's look at Ellen Craft's album first. She did have a very public presence nationally and even internationally. She and her husband, William, became famous in 1848 when they managed this incredible escape from Georgia all the way up to Philadelphia. Ellen Craft was very light-skinned, so she was able to pass, but she couldn't pass as a woman traveling with an enslaved Black man. So she cut her hair and passed as a white male enslaver who went by the name William Johnson. And then her husband, William, passed as her, or uh, masqueraded as her enslaved manservant. And they successfully fooled people on carriages, trains, and a steamship going all the way up to Philadelphia over several days. Once they got there, they moved up to Boston, and with the help of Quakers in Philadelphia and then the abolitionist community in Boston, became quite celebrated for this incredible feat. Nevertheless, 2 years after their escape, they had to escape once again after the passage of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, at which point it became possible for slave catchers to come up to Boston and forcibly bring them back down to the South into enslavement. So they escaped to England at that point, and that's where Ellen Craft made her photo album before returning after the end of the Civil War back to the United States and settling in Charleston. All right, so in England, the Crafts learned to read and write, and they published their escape narrative, which included a frontispiece illustration, which you're seeing right here, of Ellen that had been based on a photograph that she had taken in Boston in the year or so after their escape, where she put on the costume again that she had worn while escaping. And um, this image is very much like the kinds of images that Frederick Douglass or Sojourner Truth were making. This photograph was taken to be a public image, then translated into a print form for the book. This was not like for her private consumption. It was very much an image that was calculated to show the skill and intelligence that she, illustrated through this escape, and also to kind of poke fun at everyone who they fooled, and really in some ways kind of visualize this social construction of race and gender, right? Like that she knew the cues to fool everyone that she was this elite white male enslaver, right? And it thus enabled her and her husband's own escape. This is still the primary image by which the public knows her today. So like if you're reading in a textbook and there's one image that's going to show Ellen Craft to teach kids her story, like it's probably going to be this image. So this was her public facing image. And in fact, her album includes a copy of this image, right? It's in one of the pages of the album. It is an important image for her and for her family, and it remained in the album over decades as the family kept the album. But there are lots of other images in the album that really hadn't been reproduced because the album stayed in the family. And what I was really interested in looking at upon finding this album was, okay, well, who else is Craft beyond this public image about this escape? Like, what's her story? What's her story after? Because she lives, a long life after her escape. What is the family story? What is her life in freedom, and how does she present herself as a free woman? So she I'll start off just by showing you this image here. This is Craft 2. She is on the far right of the image on the right. Here, an older woman who has had children. They had five children, and one of her daughters is in this grouping of younger women to the left of her, and then I think the other women are likely daughters-in-law, but I'm not sure. There might be some friends and daughters-in-law in there, but she's posed in this photograph in the album um, as an older woman with a group of women of a younger generation. And her album includes images of her children, um, the spouses of her children, grandchildren. So the album does have other famous figures in it. There's a photograph of Frederick Douglass in there. But she very much is including these images of her family members in there as well as an important part of her story. And in this image, they would have been taking this in a photo studio or possibly like a pop-up photo studio. You can see there's a painted backdrop that they're seated in front of. And I find this image very interesting because behind Ellen Craft, there's a hearth, there's a fireplace back there. And then behind the women, you can just see on the far left of the image is a painted backdrop of like a tree as if they're outside. And the women each have parasols, the young women. So they've positioned themselves, intentionally or not, with Kraft, the older kind of matriarch, tending the fire by the home, and these younger women with their parasols, with the backdrop of the tree in the background, um, free to move kind of out and about. And I think that was a lot of what Kraft's album symbolized, especially making it in this still pretty dicey period where they had to escape to London. Like her choice to move towards freedom was very much about creating a family stability that was not possible under enslavement, so that her children and future generations would not be forcibly separated, right? And that they would have that stability of family and multiple generations. In their narrative about their escape, they wrote that that was their reason for taking the incredible risk of escaping and trying to escape again so far, all the way from Georgia. They had both experienced forced family separation in their own birth families. They knew as soon as they got married that that was the risk, that any children they have could be forcibly separated from them under enslavement. They could be forcibly separated from each other. And so freedom was the primary motivation for them, was in keeping the family themselves and then any children they might have together. And then the album is this documentation of that. Like it is documenting those bonds that are now protected in freedom and that she protects. All right, so the visual representation of enslaved mothers in the broader visual culture does not include sentimental photographs of enslaved women nurturing their children in safe environments, right? Instead, the image we see enslaved nurses with their enslavers' children, or we see abolitionist imagery like the illustrations from Uncle Tom's Cabin showing forced rupturing of family connections by enslavers. And Kraft's album visualizes the greater security afforded to middle-class mother-child bonds and freedom. Here you're seeing one of the photographs in the album. It's a photograph that had already been framed in cardstock and then given to Kraft. And then she takes the photograph framed in the cardstock and inserts it in one of the sleeves in the album. So you're seeing the cardstock little window here that was part of the gift to her. And this is one of her sons. You can see he's dressed in a fine suit. He's paid a little extra, which you could do in the photo studio to get a little bit of rouge added to your cheeks to give you a little bit of liveliness. And then there's fine handwriting at the bottom of the image saying, "To my dear mother," as a token of love and remembrance from her dutiful son. So he has had a photograph made. He has used his literacy, gained through the privileges of middle-class education, to inscribe it. And then he's given this photograph to her, knowing that she will put it in her album, most likely, and that these mementos of her role as a mother are important for her and for her expression of her identity in her album. All right. In other pages in the album, you can see other examples of her family members. Here on the right, you have probably one of her sons taken in London at a photo studio. And when you went to a 19th century photo studio, there would often be lots of different props that you could pick from. You could, there would be faux outdoor scenes with painted backdrops. You could lounge on couches. You could sit at tables. You could go by fireplaces. But she has chosen to pose the child in front of a desk in the act of writing, right? So again, illustrating this privilege of education that she and her husband have enabled for her children by escaping from enslavement. Okay. You can see in the image on the left a baby photograph, and you might notice there's notations down below it written on the pages of the album. What we see in 19th century albums is the first owner of an album doesn't usually write on it because they know everyone who's in the album. They put the photos in there. They can tell you the oral history if you're sitting by them. They don't need to remember because it's their memories. But then when the album gets passed down to the next generation or the next generation, people's memories are starting to fade. And so they're like, oh yeah, let me write down who this is so we don't forget what Ma told me. And then, next generation, oh yeah, gosh, I got to write grandma's memories down here or get from mom what grandma said and et cetera, et cetera. So you'll often find like different handwriting, adding more notes and like different colors of pen. And that's what we see right here. We have one person writing in blue and cursive, Charlie Craft, and then probably a later generation, like Charlie Craft isn't quite enough, like maybe there are two Charlie Crafts or who is Charlie Craft again? And then they add more information down below so you can remember better, right? So the women to whom this album was passed down to in the family kept adding to it, possibly changing some photographs and then definitely adding notes over time. And these notes, and actually, let me just tell you to whom this album passed down to. So Ellen Craft in the upper left there made the album. She then passed it down in Charleston, where she ended up settling after moving back to the United States. She passed it down to Emmeline Kinloch Craft in the upper right, who was her daughter-in-law, who married one of her sons. And then Emmeline passed it to her daughter, Julia Ellen Craft DaCosta, who's in the lower right. And then she passed it to her granddaughters, Julia Ellen Craft Davis, who's there on the left, and then Vicki Lorraine Davis, and they donated it in 2010 to the Avery. So it had been in the family 150 years before it was donated to a public archive where now the public can access it. So these notations, they can be helpful in identifying figures, especially as memory has faded. But sometimes they may have been added a little too late when the edges of memories have already begun to fade a little bit. For example, in this album, there are actually two copies of the same baby photograph on different pages of the album, and they're different notes for both of them. So this baby is Charlie Craft on one page or Harry Craft on another, right? And it can't be both. It's the same baby. So it is, a grandson, but which one, right? Not sure. All right. So, whereas the visual culture of enslaved mothers largely presents the insecurity of a mother's rights to her children, photograph albums of free 19th century Black mothers almost like overemphasize this desire to keep the memories and the rights to children. There's this strong sense of responsibility as a keeper of this secure intergenerational family memory, even when memory starts to fade a little bit. whereas enslaved women hadn't usually had the means to build up and pass on family records that were written, right? Oral history might be there, but you might not have the ability to pass on, extensive family records. Craft and her descendants did, right? And this is an important aspect of her identity and freedom that's not referenced in her famous portrait as William Johnson, right? That's really just a brief moment in time where she was escaping enslavement. Uh, this identity as a mother and freedom is not referenced in that photograph. All right. So while studying Craft's album, I sought comparisons to other similar artifacts and came across two Arabella Chapman albums from the 1870s to 1880s that had been digitized by the University of Michigan's library. And while looking at this album, it became clear that, like Craft's, it had been passed down to at least one female relative. As you can see in this photograph of Arabella and her mother, there's an inscription down below, Ma and Grandma. So she passed it at least to her daughter, if then it might not have gone further than that, but at least one generation of a female relative. But this was not the only connection between the albums. I was shocked and delighted when flipping through the pages to find the same baby in Arabella Chapman's album, right? No notation below this one. And then there's another photograph of a person that's repeated and not a famous person. Like many albums had photos of Frederick Douglass, or Abraham Lincoln. So you can see photographs that are repeated across albums, but not of a celebrity, right? So on the left, you see this photograph in Arabella Chapman's album, and then on the right, same photograph in Ellen Craft's album. Notations under each to try to help remember who this person is. The image is one of the carte de visites where you could pay extra to have, a little color added. She's had a little rouge added to her cheeks, her pink bow on her head and on her collar. You can't miss this photograph. There aren't any others with two pink bows like this. So it's very clearly the same photograph. And it wasn't too hard to figure out who this woman was. The baby is still a little bit of a mystery, but it is Sophia Kinloch McDowell, who lived in Charleston. She was Emmeline's sister, right? So Emmeline up there on the top, the daughter-in-law of Ellen Craft, who took over Ellen Craft's album. Her sister is shown here. So Emmeline probably added a photograph to Ellen Craft's album of her sister. And then somehow Arabella also ended up with a photograph of Emmeline's sister. And that suggests to me that the baby's probably Emmeline's baby. It would make sense that Emmeline would have added a photograph to hers and then also shared it with Arabella. So how does Emmeline know Arabella? Again, Emmeline's in Charleston, Ellen Craft's in Charleston, Sophia's in Charleston, but Arabella's all the way up in Albany, New York. Well, fortunately, there were a lot of other items that the Craft descendants donated to the Avery and that the Avery took. And there's an autograph album, which, like photograph albums, 19th century women kept autograph albums with mementos of friends and families, lines written in addition to signatures. Sometimes locks of hair would be pasted in, sometimes little drawings. And in Emmeline's autograph album, there are a bunch of notes from people who lived in Albany, including Arabella herself, her father, John Chapman, and then her husband. So through these notations, you can figure out that Emmeline actually left Charleston for a brief while in her 20s and lived for a while up in Albany, New York. Her connection in Albany and the person whom she lived with was Joseph Aubin Smith, who was her uncle who had been born in Charleston, but who left Charleston to work a prestigious job in hotels in New York. And working in prominent service roles in hotels was a really good job for African Americans in the 19th century. So he went up to the elite hotels in New York to do that. And Arabella Chapman's father also had a prominent role working in New York hotels. So they were the father and uncle were likely friends. And when Emmeline was living in Albany, she was in her 20s and unmarried, and so was Arabella. So they were likely young, they'd finished their education, weren't yet married, had this family connection, probably became friends. And then when Emmeline moved back down to Charleston and got married, they likely kept correspondence through the mail and shared photographs, and that's probably how those photographs ended up in Arabella's album. Here you're seeing photographs of the relatives that Emmeline stayed with up in Albany, Sarah Smith and Joseph Aubin Smith. The photograph on the left is in the Craft Archives in Charleston. The photo on the right is actually in Arabella's album. Sarah Smith, so the wife of Emmeline's uncle, was actually the mother of Arabella's future husband. So they actually are distantly related cousins by marriage. All right. So over the years and across a great distance, the two women kept their bond, right? They kept this connection forged just over, a short 1 to 2 year period, but preserved it, and then their descendants preserved it in the photograph albums as well. The connection was lost to memory, right? Family members did not remember this connection. But the albums were so successful at preserving this connection, and then people were so successful at keeping those archives and then preserving them in the public, that a researcher who has no connection at all to these families was able to reconstruct it, right? So those books were very solid and secure record keepers of family and friendship bonds. The stability of these records, right, provides such a strong contrast to the instability of the bonds and enslavement that Ellen Craft was so focused on escaping, right? Women use these albums to affirm their strength in forming and keeping bonds between family members, even distant ones, and especially between women and children. In both of these albums, the photographs depict their female sitters as carefully comported to display feminine beauty, middle-class status, and Christian piety. A portrait of Chapman as a young woman on the right here presents her as comported and well-dressed. She's in a portrait studio with a scenic painted landscape backdrop. Her clothing and demeanor suggest reserve and propriety. Her gaze is indirect. She wears a modest, long button-down gown with a high neck. She has her hair parted down the middle and pulled back. She wears earrings, a metal bracelet, a pocket watch that sits in her breast pocket with a chain attached. She sits on a plush stool with a soft, tasseled armrest whose thick fringe elicits a sense of tactility, and her cheeks are warmed by being painted rosy. Craft, here young and in London at the time that her photograph was taken, on the left here, wears a fine dress. She's at ease, posed with her hands on the back of a tufted chair. She turns toward the camera but does not meet its eye directly, showing modesty and propriety. Of note, she is not shown as a laborer in this photo, right? Both of these women are at ease, at rest, at comfort. And if Craft had not escaped enslavement and had been forced to be photographed, like, she would have probably been shown in some form of the value of the labor that she would produce. So she is very much representing herself in the conventions of the time, of ideal femininity as not at work, right, but at rest. In fact, Craft likely modeled her dress and the pose on the fashion at the time in England, where the British royal family had thoroughly embraced photography, really producing, the first like celebrity photographs of themselves, widely circulated images that were collected by the public, which Craft would have had access to living there. In fact, her album has other images of the British royal family. Note the image on the right, captioned Friends in London of the British royal family. Um, and the Princess of Wales there on the left. Kraft was navigating the politics of respectability while an expat in London, where she was still facing the threat, if she returned to the United States, of possibly being forced back into enslavement. The British royal family, widely promoted in the media, I can imagine being possibly a counterpoint to the failure of the US government in protecting the Kraft family at this time after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. Studies have addressed how 19th century African American women sometimes adopted European and Euro-American period ideals of respectable femininity as part of a larger project of racial uplift. 19th century US and European ideals of femininity were decidedly white. Women of color had to navigate this terrain, and adopting such ideals of femininity was a calculation, sometimes made in the hopes of raising not just one's own status, but also that of one's children and even the race at large. Middle-class African-American women were fully aware of the widespread degrading stereotypes of Black women and families as unrefined and uneducated in popular media. Arabella, Emmeline, Sophia, and Ellen Craft resisted this stereotype by aligning their and their children's respectability with the dominant codes at the time. African-American women's magazines and guidebooks even encouraged middle-class Black women to uphold respectability, not just for themselves and their families, but for the good of the race. Magazines like Ringwood's Afro-American Journal of Fashion encouraged mothers to maintain clean homes, teach their children Christian values, occupy themselves and their children with music, games, books, and to refuse alcohol and loud public behavior. Conduct and etiquette books argued that a Black mother's role in structuring the home determined whether her children would grow up to be productive members of their community and exemplars of the race, or instead turn to crime and degeneracy. One guidebook illustrated parental success or failure with photographs of young children, children of the poor and uneducated on the left here, and children of pure and intelligent parents on the right. Present two grids of 24 close-up photographic portraits of young children. Children from the first group do not smile. Several have furrowed brows and wear simple clothes. Children in the second group have more elite clothing and accessories, including several elaborate bows. A few of them smile, and one baby even laughs. You might notice that the children of the second group also have a wider variety of skin tones and hair textures, indicating more mixed European and African ancestry, as was also true of the members of Craft's family. Historian Noli Rooks has revealed how many late 19th century middle-class African American women resignified their lighter skin from a marker of enslaver rape to an indication of elite status that they also believed could help them uplift the race. Readers of magazines like Ringwood's were given images of white fashion models and taught how to dress modestly and comport themselves with modesty to show or prove that they were real women, ladies. These acts were meant to distinguish them from popular stereotypes about Black women as morally, socially depraved due to the irreparable damages of enslavement. Rooks argued that these women's embrace of Euro-American informed ideals of femininity enabled them to refashion and rewrite rape and violence while not forgetting it. So granting an element of agency in an otherwise very complicated and difficult situation. This information, I think, helps to contextualize Craft and Chapman's photographs of healthy, privileged children as demonstrations of a mother's success in transcending the past degradations of bondage, very much evident on Ellen Craft's own skin, forced upon women and their families. All right, to conclude, Craft's albums and Chapman's reveal how free 19th century Black American women used family photograph albums to memorialize proud and secure identities and family legacies, and to resist dehumanizing imagery and the legacies of enslavement. These memories were first supported and maintained by descendants, And now, more recently, their caretaking has expanded to public archives where their stories and the circle of their influence can widen even further and become part of our national conversation and history. And I just wanted to mention, Samuel thought you might be interested in just hearing a little bit about how to research your own family photographs. If you aren't already doing that, I imagine some of you might already um, be um, be doing that. But like with the Craft and Chapman archives, one of the best resources for finding about your family photographs is your family, right? Like go to family members and ask them, where are our family photographs? Who are these people in the photographs? What are the stories you can remember? And record as much of that down as you can, or record it in audio form. Uh, and it might not just be for you, it might be for future family members or even for public archives, that information that isn't recorded anywhere else could be really important for future conversations on stories. StoryCorps is a really wonderful resource for doing audio recordings of family history. They have an app, and my sister and I recorded an interview with my father just because I was teaching it, and I thought, oh, I should, record. I should try this too. I'm having my students do it, and my father ended up passing away a few years later unexpectedly during the pandemic, and the fact that we now have this recording of his memories of his childhood is so valuable. That will be something that my children will be able to listen to. And I'm just so glad I did it. So it's free. StoryCorps is wonderful. You might hear their stories on NPR and, other, I think their stories are circulated regularly in the media. So and they'll archive it for free for you. So it's really useful. Family Search is like the free version of ancestry.com, and people upload photos on there. So you can find sometimes interesting family photos, some distant cousin uploaded on there. Your local historical society can often have really great photos. And then there are national museums too that have genealogy centers. The National Museum of African American History and Culture offers free sessions and appointments virtually over Zoom as well as in person. And then here in Charleston, we have the International African American Museum that has a number of resources available online too. And they also do consultations virtually and can help you research your family as well as find family photographs. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this talk.